Howdy and welcome to Bamberger Ranch. My name is Aldo Leopold. I'm the director of the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and we're going to continue our Leopold Live series here at Bamberger, continuing to talk about the 5 basic tools introduced by Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management. These 5 tools include cow, axe, plow, fire, and gun. And what we hope to do in the upcoming months is show you how those tools can be applied, but with very specific projects and objectives. And so with me is Dr. April Sampson. She's the executive director of Bamberger, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Bamberger and what we hope to cover in the series.
Great. Thank you so much, Roel. We're really excited to have you and your colleagues from the Natural Resources Institute back here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. And we're excited about continuing our journey into Leopold Live version 2. Like Roel said, we'll be providing more detail and more useful information regarding the 5 tools that Aldo Leopold championed. Here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is landowner stewardship, outreach, and environmental education. So we have many Central Texas school children that come visit us every year for hands-on science-based environmental education lessons, and we also lead showcase tours and workshops for landowners interested in practicing restoration and good land stewardship. So we're very happy to be partnering with Natural Resources Institute, and we know that you'll benefit a lot from the information that we are going to be talking about during this new version of Leopold Live.
So let's go ahead and get started.
Great. Good morning and welcome to Bamberger Ranch Preserve. My name is April Sampson. I'm very happy to be here with Mason Moreland.
Thank you.
Deputy Chief Tax Appraiser.
Correct.
For Blanco County. And Bamberger Ranch Preserve is located in Blanco County. So we're really excited to have Mason here to talk to us a little bit about the 1D1 tax valuations that property owners can avail of. And since Mason is right here in Blanco County, that's very pertinent to our situation here at Bamberger Ranch Preserve. So Mason, I thought maybe to start off, you could kind of just give us an overview of the 1D1 valuation and you know, kind of talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Yes. So in Blanco County, up into agriculture valuation, wildlife valuation, and there's also a beekeeping valuation, which is actually under the agriculture umbrella. So if a property qualifies, a property owner can choose to seek valuation based on agriculture use or wildlife use to seek a reduced value for property tax purposes.
Wonderful, that's great, thank you. So can you talk a little bit, Mason, about how counties may differ in terms of their requirements or regulations for landowners?
Yes, so that's a very good point. So a lot of the wildlife information is handed down from the state level, so a lot of the rules do apply universally, but there are still some differences. And then under the agriculture side of things, there are a lot of variances between county and county. You know, the tax code says what is typical for the area, and so each area is going to have a different intensity requirement, a number of animal units, and that sort of thing. So yes, you know, what we're going to talk about today is more applying to Blanco County specifically. So if whoever's watching out there, you know, hears something and they want to know, what does that apply for my county, you should reach out to your appraisal district locally, talk to them. It's probably going to line up close, but it may not be exactly the same. So definitely a good idea to reach out to your local tax authority and talk to them before you make any decisions about what you should have on the property.
Wonderful, that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am.
And that's it. It makes sense that it's built into the legislation.
Correct.
Because Texas is so big
and diverse.
Yes. Right? So there's a lot of variability across the 254 counties. So
exactly.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yes, ma'am.
Yep. Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about how a property owner engages in acquiring an ag valuation, because along those same lines, I believe that a property needs to have an ag valuation first,
correct,
before the landowner can then apply,
correct,
for the wildlife valuation.
Yes, that's correct. So, and this is statewide. So, in order to receive a wildlife appraisal, a property owner must have a valid and current 1D1 ag appraisal on the property to start with. We'll start talking about just general agriculture through grazing applications. That's the one of the more common types. So in Blanco County, you have to show that for at least the past 5 years, the property's been used for an a qualifying agricultural practice, and that 5-year history is important. Once you have that, then you are able to apply for a agriculture or 1D1 appraisal on the property, and once you have secured that, then you can look at options to transfer to a wildlife exemption. There are some, we'll talk about some acreage requirements in a little bit on that, but generally speaking, that's going to be the main requirement for a 1D1 agriculture appraisal with grazing, is that you would need to have the property grazed to the typical intensity for at least the past 5 years, and adhere to the county stocking ratios and any other requirements they may have. For Blanco County specifically, we require at least 2 animal units. Now, that's not to be confused. One cow or one cow-calf pair is equal to 1 animal unit, but when you talk about sheep or goats or a smaller species, it takes more of them to equal an animal unit. So at Blanco County and most counties will have a guide, and it'll show all the equivalents of what it takes to get to that 1 animal unit. But in Blanco County, again, minimum of 2 animal units. Acreage is typical around here is 10 acres or greater for a 1D1 grazing application, and there's also a home site acre to be factored in for Blanco County. So if the property owner is going to have a house or cabin or residence of any type on the property, there is a 1 acre parcel that's going to be considered home site. So in addition to that, the property owner must have 10 acres.
In addition to that 1 acre,
correct,
where the home is, or
correct,
the living quarters,
exactly,
whatever it is.
Exactly, right. And so there needs to be that. So in that case, it would technically be around 11 acres if you're going to have an improvement on the property to qualify. And so once you have that, the idea is that you maintain, you may increase or decrease herd sizes depending on weather conditions and property size, that sort of thing. So in Blanco County, again, the average animal unit to acreage is about 1 animal unit to every 25 acres is kind of what we look at. But again, it varies widely even within the county, depending on the type of property, how much cedar is there, how, is it improved grasses, is it native grasses, and that sort of thing. But that's what we look for from a grazing standpoint for a 1D1 ag appraisal. The other option under the ag umbrella is beekeeping. So that's fairly new. It's been around for less than 10 years, I believe.
Okay.
And it is tailored towards smaller size properties. So again, agriculture through grazing, at least in Blanco County, is typically 10 plus the 1 home site. Beekeeping is between 5 and 20 acres. So you have to at least have 5 acres, but not more than 20 acres. And again, still considering that 1 acre home site. So if it's an improved property, would add an acre to the 5 and the 20. So the idea behind beekeeping is that you install and establish honeybee hives on the property. And I'll go over the requirements in a minute as far as the numbers, but you will be required to have a certain number of hives. You maintain those. The same 5-year history applies to this.
Okay.
If you already have an existing 5-year history of grazing, that can roll over. If you don't, then you would start with the beekeeping, start establishing your hives on the property, managing the property for the betterment of the hives, and move forward with that. And then after your 5 years of ag history through beekeeping, you would be granted your ag appraisal, based on beekeeping. And then in Blanco County, again, the hive requirement, we just have 2 minimums, and we broke it down into 2 acreage categories. So anybody that has a property that's 5 acres to 13 acres, you need a minimum of 6 beehives.
6
and then,
beehives.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And then 13 acres to 20 acres, you would need a minimum of 8 beehives. And that's pretty much what we require. They do need to be active. If a property owner loses a hive, that's not necessarily going to cancel your exemption immediately, but you do need to have a plan to replace that hive to be back up to our minimum intensity requirements.
That's great. So what I'm hearing there is that the beekeeping gives a landowner who has a smaller piece of land
Correct.
an opportunity to think about qualifying for that valuation.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's designed for those properties. So we saw a lot of properties that previously were not qualified for ag based on size for grazing get to have that benefit now because of the beekeeping. And I can go ahead and talk real quick about the difference between the value. So there is a slight ag value difference between general ag value and beekeeping value. So,
okay.
All ag values are based on a productivity value of the property. So we look at, specifically for grazing, we look at lease rates for grazing and lease rates for hunting. And you take those potential rates for the property along with any expenses that you need to take out, and we capitalize that into a value per acre. So for Blanco County currently, our standard pasture class property would come in at about $105 per acre value. By using your tax rate. That means for every property that has an ag valuation, you're paying about $1.50 per acre if you have an ag valuation on the property.
Right.
That would be the benefit versus paying at whatever the current market value of the property is and then using the current tax rate.
Right.
In this case, in current time, it's a lot more than that. So it's a great deal to great savings. For the beekeeping, it's a similar process, but rather than looking at lease rates, it's looking at honey production. So it looks at what, and I think we get a lot of data from USDA, and there's a lot of, it's really statewide, maybe further than that, but they look at typical honey production, and it just looks at wholesale prices, and they calculate what a typical hive produces, and again take out to look at the production, take out the expenses, capitalize that into a value. And currently with beekeeping, depending on the size of the property and the amount of hives, you're looking at $1,000 to $1,500 per acre is the bee productivity value. Still a lot less than your typical market value, but that's the difference between those two. And then looking at it from a wildlife perspective, wildlife mirrors our general ag value. So the previous value of roughly $105 an acre in Blanco County would apply to any property that transitions over to a wildlife value.
I see. Great. Yes, I think that's really useful and good information.
Thank you.
And so just to kind of circle back a little bit, so for the specific information for people's county that they're in, if they're not in Blanco County, they would come to the tax appraisal district office for all of this specific information that you are so kindly sharing with us right now.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct. So, or specifically the county appraisal district, they're the one that is going to set the rules and typical standards for that county. So, I know even locally there are differences between our surrounding counties. So if you're interested in those, definitely talk to your local county appraisal district to find out exactly what animals they require or hives they require to do that.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That's great. So last year it was, I believe, we had the opportunity to have as a guest speaker on our Leopold Live series, David Langford, who was very involved in getting the legislation passed.
Okay.
Back in the 90s, when all of us were not yet in the career world.
That's correct.
And that was a really neat experience for us. Can you talk a little bit about and you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about kind of the idea behind these valuations and how they could be, we talked about how they can be beneficial to landowners, but let's talk a little bit about the philosophy about being about it being beneficial to the land itself.
Exactly. So, you know, specifically for wildlife management, you know, the idea was that by allowing these exemptions, it would promote people to, you know, or encourage people to take care of their property in better ways, to do these activities that not only benefit, you know, the people, but also benefit the wildlife and livestock and just in general the whole area. So, you know, I believe that was the initial intent of everything. Again, agriculture was the initial appraisal that was always allowed, you know, and whether it was farming or grazing or timber, those were things that, and then it evolved into wildlife, like you said, in the 90s, and since then it's been growing. We've had a steady transition from ag to wildlife. I wouldn't say a boom, but it's been steady, and yeah, it's a great thing. It really promotes, you know, the betterment of all the properties in the area. And it's very popular here in Blanco County.
Wonderful.
Yes.
That's great. Thanks for that.
Yes,
That's
ma'am.
useful. Can we talk a little bit about, again, here in Blanco County, whether horses will qualify for an ag exemption?
Yes.
I mean, excuse me, an ag valuation.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, horses do qualify in Blanco County. So a lot of counties will require a horse operation to be a breeding horse operation, meaning that you have a stud, you have mares. The idea behind that is that you are producing colts and foals for, you know, various reasons. In Blanco County, though, you know, we read the tax code. It's up to interpretation. We believe that based on the statement of keeping, raising or keeping livestock, that horses do qualify here, even if they're not breeding, as long as they have access to the total property that they're seeking the appraisal for, and they're utilizing that property. Horses are like cattle or a cow-calf pair are 1-to-1, so with that 2-animal unit requirement, you would need 2 horses on a property.
Right, because it's also a large animal.
Correct.
Like a cow.
Yes, ma'am.
Right.
Exactly. So, again, 2 for Blanco County, and as long as they have access and are grazing the property just as a cow, sheep, goat, or anything else would, it would qualify in that case. The main points there would be that it cannot be you know, kept in a stall all the time, because, you know, for exemption or for appraisal purposes, again, they need access to the full property. So it's a requirement that they be turned out. But again, no breeding is required in Blanco County. But again, other counties do typically require that, or a lot of areas do. So if you're not in Blanco County, make sure you talk to the appraisal district in your county to verify that. But here, horses do, and again, there's lots of horses in the area, so people do frequently use that as a means to receive their agriculture exemption.
Sure, absolutely. As long as those horses are roaming about over the whole property.
Yes, exactly.
So it's another reason for a landowner to get to know their appraisal district.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Excellent. Let me think. Oh, I know what I'd like to sort of move towards next.
Okay.
So it's really, really helpful to have the background on the ag valuation, because we know that a landowner can move towards the wildlife valuation once they have the ag.
Correct.
So let's talk about some of the activities or some of the things that a landowner can do when they're thinking about trying to qualify for the wildlife valuations.
Okay.
So some of the things that they can do on their property to qualify for that valuation.
Okay, so yes, so again, as we stated earlier, they do have to have a current 1D1 ag, whether it be beekeeping or grazing or farming. They do need to have that prior to seeking a wildlife exemption. But let's assume a property owner does already have that established, and they want to transition to wildlife. So the first step is obviously notify the county appraisal district that that's what they're wanting to do. Timing wise, you will want to make sure that you do that between January and the end of April of whatever year it is that you're applying for.
Good
so
to know.
you can start the process earlier if you want to, but the deadline is is always going to be April 30th of whatever year it is that you're working towards. So the first step would be to create a plan and overall goals and objectives for the property and what you want to do. It does also need to make sense with the property size. So for instance, if you've got 10 acres and you're going to transition that to a wildlife exemption, white-tailed deer are probably not going to be your focus species. It's going to be something more like songbirds or small mammals, and that should apply pretty much statewide as well, everywhere the same way. Some counties may differ a little bit on what they would consider the amount of acreage for white-tailed deer specifically, but generally speaking, smaller properties are going to be the smaller animals. Larger properties is where you would manage the bigger species. Right. So again, you want to start with a concept and plan for the property. The requirements are that you do, there's seven categories. You must do 3 of those each year to qualify for wildlife exemption.
3 of the 7.
Exactly. I would say the most typical for Blanco County is going to be supplemental food, supplemental water, and supplemental shelter. Those are 3 things that are typically easy to obtain and easy to maintain going down the road. Right. But in addition to those 3, there's also habitat control, erosion control, predator control, and census counts. I believe that's all 7. Is that correct? Okay. And so those are the general categories that you would look at, and then you kind of look at your property and decide what makes sense to do on the property and what you think you can accomplish realistically. Right. It may be all 7 categories, and that's great, but if it's just 3, that's still fine, but you have to make sure you're at least doing those 3 each year. So the forms required are going to be the typical 1D1 agriculture appraisal form, which is for agriculture use, but there's a section about wildlife management. You would fill that in, and then in addition to that, there's a Texas Parks and Wildlife management plan, and that is another form that you will complete, sign it. That's an overlooked thing. Some people don't sign the form, and submit those together. And then in Blanco County, we also require or encourage a kind of a summary, a written summary, or kind of an essay format of what you put down on that Texas Parks and Wildlife application. So what your goals are, what your ideas are for the property, maybe specifically where you're going to do that at. Sure. And then in addition to that, usually a simple map that indicates where your feed locations, shelter locations, where you're going to clear brush at, where you're going to leave brush at, etc. So that's kind of the packet of information that you would gather up and fill out and submit to our office. That's by doing that is what is going to transition your property from ag to wildlife and get you started. And then down the road, after you've kind of got that initial set of plans submitted to our office, Blanco County doesn't send out an official approval letter, but if there is an issue with the application, we'll reach out to the property owner, let them know that we need different things done, they missed something, whatever the case may be, and work with them to get that done by the deadline. So I also encourage people to turn the applications in as early as possible rather than wait till April 30th. That way, when these issues arise, we can fix them in a timely manner.
That makes a lot of sense. So then the landowner could work with your office to correct whatever the problems were in the application. Exactly.
We try to do that rather than just rejecting it and not giving any feedback. If we see a problem, we try to give as much feedback as possible and work with the property owner for that. And that's the general process. I don't think I left any steps out, but that's the general process to transition and what you need to do to file that. And another thing I'll point out, and I don't know if it's county or statewide, but the wildlife plan, you don't always, what you put on there doesn't mean these things have already all been done. A lot of things you are looking forward, and that's one thing I failed to mention. We look at it as a 5-year plan. So typically when you're putting these things on paper, you're looking ahead, saying these are your goals and what you want to do. Again, keeping in mind that you're going to at least do 3 of these activities a year. Right. But again, whatever you put on that form doesn't mean that you've already done all that. You may have done some things, which is great.
It's a good distinction, isn't it?
Yes. That's a common question we get at the office a lot, and something that I think should be pointed out. Again, verify that with each county. They may have a 3-year plan or differ, but in Blanco County, typically you look forward, and about every 5 years you update your master wildlife plan to keep it on track. And then another portion of this, once you've got the transition done and you've turned in your form, we've accepted it, you're now considered under a wildlife appraisal. we do require annual updates.
Oh,
so
okay.
some counties do, some counties don't, and Blanco County does. However, it's a little misleading. It is an annual update, but we actually require it every 2 years. We split the county up basically half and half, so depending on last name, and really more so for our purposes, so we're able to get through the amount of paperwork that comes in.
Right.
So A through J, last name A through J in Blanco County turns in odd every even year. Last name K through J or K through Z turns in every odd year. And the update here, there is again a Texas Parks and Wildlife annual update form that can be used. We also have a little simplified version for Blanco County that is also acceptable. A property owner can choose to use either one, and basically they list the activities in Blanco County's case in the past 2 years that they've completed on the property.
Okay.
And again, keeping in mind when you're putting that information on there, we need to be able to clearly see what was done and those 3 activities were done each of those years. Currently we don't require receipts and pictures to accompany it. It can if they wish to, but that's not a requirement. Again, trying to kind of cut down on the amount of paperwork that comes in.
Absolutely.
But that is a requirement here. Some counties may not require the annual update, and they just simply rely on property inspections. So they'll go out, look at the property. If it checks out, everything's fine. If it doesn't, they'll reach out to the property owner to let them know they need to do something different. We kind of use a combination to where we do ask for the updates, but we do also verify data by either physical, on-site inspections. We have aerial data that we can use.
Okay.
Believe it or not, we can see a deer feeder sitting out in the middle of the pasture.
Yeah, thanks to technology, right?
And see if it's being frequented or not. Yes, so we use various means to do physical inspections, but we do heavily rely on the annual updates as a means to are they doing what they're supposed to.
Sure.
So once you've filled out the appropriate documents to initiate the wildlife appraisal, once that's started, then every 2 years in Blanco County, you'll be sending us updates, basically telling us, hey, how's the progress going on the property, and are you doing what you're supposed to?
Right, wonderful, that's great. And it's yet another reason for a property owner to get to know their tax appraisal district folks.
Yes, we can't stress that enough. I encourage that a lot. Ask questions. A lot of things are done incorrectly simply because somebody doesn't know about it. So
Right.
the more questions you can ask and the more familiar you can become with the appraisal district, the better. And I would say all appraisal districts will have a website as well.
Okay.
And just like ours, we have a packet for wildlife, general ag, and beekeeping. So a person can go online, download that PDF packet, and it, in the wildlife packet, there's actually a sample plan that's already filled out.
Excellent.
And somebody volunteered that information, and we have that out there and kind of a guide people can use. And the same thing for the beekeeping and agriculture use, and gives you all the requirements and stuff out there, and every county is going to have a similar version of that. So that's another place to go and look and get good information.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's quite a few resources for property owners right there on the website of their tax appraisal district. That's great.
For
So
sure.
another great place to start.
Yes.
They're starting to think about these.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. Maybe start by looking up that information, get your questions that you would like to ask or concerns, and then go to your appraisal district and talk to them more in detail about it. And then after that, you should be prepared to do your plan and go through the process.
Sure, wonderful. So talk a little bit, if you would, about exotics. We know that we have a lot of exotic species in Texas.
We do.
And so talk about that a little bit in the context of these valuations.
Correct. So wildlife management is tailored towards native wildlife species. Most exotic species could be considered wildlife because they are similar to our native deer species and others. But for the wildlife valuation, the practices and the activities that you do need to be again tailored towards the native species. So white-tailed deer, turkeys, doves, songbirds, small mammals. Those are examples of the qualified species that you can manage for. Axis deer is, especially in this area, is a big exotic that we have. They are free-ranging typically, and yes, they can be managed sometimes with deer or other species, but again, a property owner cannot make that their focus and receive the wildlife benefit. It's got to be native species that you are primarily managing for in order to qualify for that. So any of those exotics, although sometimes can be used in conjunction with native species, are not the focus of it. It's all native wildlife.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Absolutely. And if a property owner was thinking about those exotic species, it might go hand in hand with some of their management goals, but
Exactly.
it's not the focus.
Exactly. Yeah. So some things can be done, some things should not be done together.
Right.
But correct. Yeah, you want to make sure that the focus is on the native species, and just try that's what it's designed for, is the native wildlife for the area.
Right. Wonderful. Great. Can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences, and again, without any individual property owner, but some of the most common things? You mentioned that in Blanco County, supplemental shelter, supplemental food,
And water.
were the
Yes.
three. Are those
Correct.
the three that you most commonly see?
I think so. And I would say the reason for that is usually a property owner is going to, or especially if you're living on the property, those are going to be three of the easier things to accomplish.
Right.
Maybe not less expensive, but easier things to do. Most people, whether they have dogs or pets or livestock, will have some sort of water location set up. And normally, even if it's set up for them, a lot of times that's still going to be utilized by the wildlife. But there are other types of water locations, guzzlers, troughs that can be put up specifically for wildlife. But water, again, generally is something that is already there and an easy activity to complete for property owners. And again, with water, once you have done that, as long as it's still providing that source of water, it's an ongoing activity that you can continue to use year after year. And really the same thing holds true with food and shelter. Whether it's protein feeders, corn feeders, bird feeders, turkey feeders, there's lots of options out there. It's probably fairly typical that people feed year round here, but that is not a requirement. It can also be seasonal and for different purposes. Some for hunting, some for just watching, some for just the benefit of the wildlife for supplementation during dry periods or stress periods. But there's various reasons why they would do it. But again, feed is usually a typical activity and an ongoing one as long as that feeder or that area is still being used the same way. Food plots are another thing, not as common here because we don't have the moisture that some areas do. But another thing that can be used, and when we do have moisture, can be very effective. And then shelter. Typically with shelter, we see on the smaller properties that are focusing more towards the songbirds management, bird houses, bat houses, owl houses. Those are the most common. And then another actually really common thing is brush piles. So people may not realize that as being a shelter activity, but a lot of people tend to do some type of clearing on their property, especially if they're new landowners. And a lot of times, rather than just burning everything, if you'll leave those placed throughout the property, birds and other small animals will use those brush piles as shelter and can be very effective. So again, those are the three most typical things I see. I would say the next would be habitat control, specifically cedar clearing. That there's not necessarily, we don't have a set requirement of acres per year. Again, that largely depends on the property and the size of the property and the amount of cedar that's there. But that's another common one. And then again, there are various other activities. But I would say those are the most common and usually easiest to attain as far as your exemption to start with. And then what we see a lot of times too is once people start to get more comfortable with doing this process, they tend to branch out and start finding other areas that they want to do. So even though those are your base or your core activities, then people will try to find other new things to do and implement. So
as they continue really on their land stewardship journey, they might branch out a little bit.
Yep, exactly.
That's great, and I'm glad the brush piles came up because it makes a lot of sense when you said that some of these activities are a little bit easier than others, like path of least resistance, right?
Exactly.
And so most people are going to be dealing with some sort of woody encroachment, and
usually,
so they may have plenty of brush piles that they can distribute across their landscape.
Yep, and typically see a mixture of birdhouses and brush piles, but it could be exclusively one or the other. So, whatever works for that property, but very typical in this area.
Wonderful.
Yes.
That's great. That I'd like to switch back to the ag valuation.
Okay.
Since we know that's so important as a foundation for the wildlife valuation.
Correct.
And talk a little bit about And when you said dry periods,
Yes.
it really made me want to ask this question. Obviously, in Blanco County, as with many places across the state, we're in a pretty serious drought right now.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about the ag valuation and the resting period, for example,
Sure.
that a landowner can use and yet still qualify for their ag valuation?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that,
Sure.
please?
So in a typical year, the districts typically require the property owner to adhere to what the minimum stocking ratios are. And again, for Blanco County, the minimum is 2 animal units, but then keeping in mind roughly an average of 1 animal unit to every 25 acres, depending on your property size. That's kind of what we would look for as a baseline for this is what you should stock the property with. However, it is common, unfortunately, to have dry periods in Blanco County, and you know, we don't want a property owner to hurt their property, so we're usually pretty good about working with that property owner to either reduce herd size or, in a small property, maybe completely rest the property for a time period. If it's during drought conditions, a property owner maybe won't necessarily have to file for a rest year, and I'll go over that in a minute about what that is specifically, but typically they can work with the appraisal district, stay in contact with us, let us know that we need to rest for a little while. There's simply no grass available. And again, with the idea in mind to not hurt the property, we'll allow them to either destock or reduce herd size and not count against their agriculture valuation. They can still maintain that.
For them to still maintain it without hitting the land too hard.
Correct.
In a period of dryness.
Yes, ma'am. Correct. And so during dry periods, we just try to work with property owners to do what makes sense for that property. In a typical year where maybe it's not so dry, but a property owner believes that the property's been overgrazed, or for whatever reason they need to rest, per the state law, a property owner is allowed to rest 2 out of a 7-year period. So for every 7 years, you could lay out for those 2 years. Typically, we don't advise do it consecutively because if you use your 2 years of rest right off the bat, then technically for the next 5 years, you have to have livestock on your property, assuming there's not a drought.
Exactly. Not to cash it all in at the beginning.
Exactly. So if somebody's going to do that, a lot of times that's done for fencing purposes, or for if they are going to reseed areas or cedar clearing, and a lot of times, especially if it's a large property and they work with I believe it's NRCS and the cost share cedar program, a requirement sometimes is that you defer the grazing for a period of time afterwards to let the grass grow back, and that makes great sense, and we don't want to interfere with that. So those are all reasons that a property owner may use a rest or an idle year, as another thing we'll call it, to let the land grow, let the grass grow before they graze it to the intensity again. So again, during drought periods, typically the property owner, I would encourage them just to work with your local appraisal district, ask them what can or can't be done as far as stocking ratios go, and then if a property owner truly feels that they just need to completely rest, then typically you would notify the appraisal district that, hey, we need to let our property rest for however long we're going to. Again, I would not advise all 2 years at once, maybe for that year, and then typically the appraisal district will accept that, and then usually the next year the property owner will reapply or tell us what they're doing again to continue maintaining. And again, during these rest periods, the property owner will still maintain the ag valuation. It doesn't go away. It's just a function to help the property and help rest the property if it's needed.
Sure, help take care of that landscape.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Wonderful. That's really helpful. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you feel that you would like for landowners to know, whether they're thinking about either one of these valuations or whether they're already well into either one of them?
Those are questions.
Things that you think that it would be useful for a property owner to know.
So I think we've covered the general, in a nutshell, the process and requirements. I can't stress enough for talking with your local appraisal district. We're happy to educate people, and that's usually the main downfall, is that people don't understand the process or don't know.
They just don't know.
Because if you don't work with it every day, it's hard to understand. There's a lot of information there. So I would stress to reach out to your local authority, talk to them, get to know them, and then they're a very valuable resource. And from a wildlife standpoint, Texas Parks and Wildlife, they're a great resource. They're typically happy to come out to your property. Every area has like a district or area biologist. They can meet with you, make sure your plan makes sense. We at the appraisal district are not biologists. We may have some background or knowledge in the area, but that's a very good resource for property owners to reach out to when specifically looking at a wildlife plan. And then for that matter, for agriculture use, typically there's like a local NRCS office, and they are a good resource as well to come out and check, if you're grazing it properly or what things can be done, soil test, a number of other things. So, I think I would definitely stress, use your local resources, reach out to those people, and usually, and a lot of that is all free as well, so it doesn't cost you anything, and it's very good for you and the property and helps you learn a lot more. So I would stress that, and again, a lot of what we talked about today does apply to Blanco County, maybe not every other county, so always for sure just check that before you dive into something and make that assumption.
Right, absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
Just get to know your local office. I think that's great advice on a lot of different levels.
Yes.
Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of resources for landowners at the local level.
Exactly.
That's great.
Yes.
This is really helpful in terms of this discussion, because one of our landowner workshops that we offer here at Bamberger Ranch Preserve kind of follows the 1D1 wildlife valuation opportunities for landowners. And so it's really helpful to have all this information directly from you.
Yes.
So that's excellent. Okay, what have we not talked about?
I can't think of anything. I think we've covered most of it. We did beekeeping. We did. I did say the hive requirements. Yes. So so we're good there. There's not a lot else I can think of that we haven't.
Well, I think you've
discussed.
really provided us with a lot of great information. So it's really helpful.
Thanks.
And thank you for what you do here in Blanco County. Thank you for supporting landowners in their efforts to steward their lands.
Sure.
And thank you for making yourself available to landowners who have questions and who want to approach the District Appraisal Office to seek answers to these kinds of questions.
Sure. No, I appreciate it, and again, I would encourage anybody that has questions to come see us. We can try to help you the best we can and kind of walk you through that process. One other thing I just thought of real quick. So a common thing is, I kind of told about the timing of things. An application does need to be in by April of each year that you're going to apply for. Another common question that we have is when a property owner purchases a piece of land, purchases happen all different times throughout the year.
Right.
So, and I think this is true for most appraisal districts, but our appraisal dates are always effective January 1 of each year. Okay. So if a property owner purchases a piece of land within whatever year that is, they won't have to actually reapply until the following year. So they typically had, again, depending on when you buy, there's going to be a period of time where you don't have to rush and try to automatically do something right away. That's a common question that people ask or assume that it all needs to be set up as soon as they get the property, but no, that technically they have until the following January after they've purchased the property to start that process, and then that following April is when they would have that all submitted to us. So,
submitted.
Yes.
That's great to know, right?
Yes.
Because you can imagine if a landowner made the purchase and then they felt like, oh, I've got to be doing this right away, and so there's a little bit of a grace period there, so that they can get their ducks in a row and get to know their appraisal
folks. Yes. No, it's a big undertaking, so given ample time to do that is necessary. So that's they should all have that. So yeah. So just a quick thought, but yes.
Sure. No,
definitely
that's a good one. We talked about being one of your most frequently asked questions for people that approach your office. And we mentioned another one earlier. Is there anything else that you hear a lot in your office?
A lot of people get confused on the history period, and also a lot of people assume that you can just start with wildlife. And again, as we've talked, you do have to have an existing agriculture appraisal before the wildlife is allowed. I have seen people just buy a property, maybe they haven't talked to us yet, and they want to start with wildlife, which you can still do wildlife activities while you're building ag history a lot of times, but that is a common thing I see, and you must have that 5-year agriculture history before whether you seek an ag appraisal, or a wildlife appraisal.
Right.
So I would say that's common, and I can't really think of a whole lot else.
That's a good one. I would imagine that you see that a lot.
We do, yes, ma'am. Yep.
So if you're a new landowner,
correct.
And we one of the things we'd like to do is really encourage new landowners to seek out resources.
Sure.
So that they can engage in sound land stewardship.
Yes.
So if you're a new landowner, you might want to, first thing you would do is find out if there's an ag valuation already associated with that piece of property.
Exactly.
And then start reaching out to your tax appraisal district and thinking about how you would maintain that ag.
Exactly.
And then already thinking towards the future. Let's say the ag valuation has only been there for 2 years. So you would already start thinking in the future about, once you have that 5-year period, that you might want to be thinking about switching into the wildlife valuation.
Correct, yes, ma'am. And typically, if there's an agriculture use that's already being granted on the property,
right.
There is going to be that 5-year history already on the property.
Right.
But if you do run into a case to where you purchase a property and the person is working, they don't have it yet, but they're working towards it. That's a good point, because that's another question. It sticks with the property, not necessarily the property owner. So if somebody has been, establishing a grazing operation, and they're 2 years in, and you buy the property, if you continue that, you can keep those 2 years of ag history for that property, and then you continue for 3 more years before you get your appraisal. But yes, that is something that will follow the property, not necessarily just the property owner.
Right, that's good to know too.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you again so very much for coming out to Bamberger Ranch Preserve today, and thank you again for what you do for the landowners of Blanco County.
You're very welcome. Thank you. I appreciate being here, and hopefully it will help people. And again, reach out to the local offices if you have questions. We're all happy to help you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Mason, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when property size decreases. So we know that all across the hill country, land is becoming a very valuable commodity.
Correct.
And sometimes these properties are split up or they decrease in size.
Correct.
So can you talk a little bit about how that affects an ag or a wildlife valuation?
Correct, yes. So for ag purposes, start with, it really is fairly simple. It's just, again, the typical for Blanco County anyways, minimum is 10 acres, again, considering the 1 acre home site. So as long as you don't drop below that for a grazing application, you're okay. Beekeeping, again, is the 5 to 20. So as long as the property doesn't go below those acreage minimums, even if it's been developed or been split off, you're okay there. With wildlife, it's a little more complicated. So for a wildlife appraisal, there is a rule that states that if a property has been reduced in size in a prior year, then the property must be at least 20 acres or greater to qualify for a wildlife appraisal. That's really the only time that there is a true acreage requirement for the wildlife appraisal, but something that is important and that property owners should be aware of. As you said, properties are being developed a lot, especially locally in the area. Lots of large ranches are being subdivided, and a lot of those properties may still qualify for wildlife, but do keep in mind that if wildlife is your goal and you're searching for properties, that reduction in acreage size is important, and it must then at least be 20 acres or greater, at least in that year. It is possible for a property owner to transition back to ag if the property still qualifies, and keep the ag appraisal for a year, and then the following year should then, assuming the property is not further split up or developed, would be able to go back towards that wildlife appraisal. But in that year that it was split off, does need to make sure that if it's being changed in size, 20 acres or greater for wildlife appraisal.
That's really good to know. That's useful information.
Yes, and it's a very common question or very common thing that people don't realize. So something to pay attention to.
Right, great. So when property owners are developing their plans, their wildlife plans for their properties, is that something that they need to hire a consultant to do, or is it something that a Parks and Wildlife biologist has to do for them? Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, that's a good question, a very common question that taxpayers ask. So there is no requirement that any of that has to be done. Those are all good resources to seek out. A private consultant, they do a great job and putting your plan together. So if you're a property owner that has no experience with this or limited time for whatever reasons, that may be an option for you to seek out. If you're comfortable with the idea of doing it yourself but don't have all the knowledge, we would suggest seek out Texas Parks and Wildlife or NRCS or our appraisal district office, and we can help you through the plan. Or if you kind of know what you're doing, just do it all yourself and bring it to us. But in either scenario, there is not a requirement anywhere that says it has to be done by a licensed biologist or by Texas Parks and Wildlife or by a consultant. A property owner can do the whole thing themselves if they want to, or if they feel comfortable doing it. So again, no requirement for that. Does not have to be approved by any of those entities. It all is going to be through our office, whether it's approved or rejected or anything like that. So on the topic of rejection or denial of an application, if a property owner submits something to our office that is not acceptable or does not meet our requirements, typically our first response is to try to work with the property owner, encourage them on what they did or didn't do, and what needs to be done different to qualify. Assuming they do that, then it'll typically go through and there's no issue. If it's to a point to where the property owner will not do that, or we can't get a hold of them, the plan or application would then be officially denied. The appraisal district is required to send via certified mail a denial and a reason for the denial. A property owner would then have 30 days from the date of that denial to protest that decision or reach out to the office to disagree with it. And that's really the process for that. If we get past the 30 days after the denial, property owner has not reached out to us, then at that point for that tax year, the property appraisal would be denied for wildlife or ag use, and the property owner would have to wait till the following cycle before they could submit a new plan or ag application.
Between January 1 and April 30th,
exactly,
right?
yes. And there is, I will say, there's one last opportunity, if you will. So the general date is January 1st through April, end of April of every tax year to qualify for ag or wildlife or beekeeping. However, if a property owner has failed to meet the April deadline, there is still a small window that they may be able to apply, but if they do that, it will be a late application, and there is a late penalty for that. But per the tax code, the property owner has only up until the date of certification of our district values, which typically happens around July 20th to July 25th. So again, if a property owner misses that April deadline, there is still a possibility of a late application, generally speaking, from the end of April to about the end of July, and could still seek that. But again, once that window is passed, then there is going to be no appraisal or exemption administered on the property, and they'll have to wait till the next January.
The next year, right?
Exactly right.
And again, it also sounds like, although that's an option, it would be much better if the landowner could go ahead and do it earlier in the year, because then they have the possibility of working directly with your office if
Yes.
there are any problems with the application.
Exactly right. Yeah, we encourage people to turn in the plans, the applications, the documents as soon as possible so we can look at it. You know, it takes time to go through this stuff, so if you turn it in at the very last minute, it's going to take us a little while to go through it. And if we find a problem and it's too late, well then, you know, we don't want to run into that issue. So the sooner you can turn that into us, the better. And generally here at Blanco County, do everything we can to work with you to make sure that it's a successful application and that it's approved and applied to the property.
Wonderful, wonderful. Once a property is approved for wildlife or ag valuation, you mentioned that there is a period, there's a review.
Correct.
Is there, in Blanco County, would there be an inspection? And would that inspection be announced by the tax appraisal district if they were coming out to a property?
Okay, yeah, good question. A lot of people ask the same thing. You know, when are you going to come out and look at our stuff? So there's not a set schedule in Blanco County that we necessarily go. You know, we don't go by every property necessarily every year to look at the ag or the wildlife on the property. But again, as we mentioned in a prior segment, the wildlife annual updates are turned into us every 2 years, and we do rely a lot on the information provided in those updates as a you know, a judge to say, you know, should we look at this property further, or do we have sufficient information? So we'll kind of go through that process along with our aerial imagery, and if we have questions or concerns or still can't verify you know, what's happening, then we will resort to a physical inspection. So yes, there may be one. You know, if the property is accessible and it's a smaller property, we may be there unannounced. But if it's a larger property and it's gated or access is difficult, then we would send a letter to the property owner asking to make an appointment with us to you know, view their property and what they're doing. So yeah, so there's not a set rule, but there is a process that we look to try to manage what people are not doing and find the ones that, you know, maybe are questionable and to make sure they are back on track and doing what they're supposed to maintain the appraisal.
Right. Sounds like another good reason to get to know your tax appraisal
For
district
sure,
folks.
yes,
Wonderful.
for sure.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, well that was pretty exciting. Thank
Sure
you for joining our session of Leopold Live. Again, we'd like to thank all those speakers and those that participated with our session. Look for upcoming sessions over the course of the next year, and our hope is to cover these very specific topics that are of interest to landowners and natural resource managers.
That's right. And I'd like to thank once again the Natural Resources Institute for coming out here and helping us provide this valuable information. At Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we hope to have our programming, including our workshops and tours, back up and running by the fall, depending on how things go. So make sure to watch for both the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute and Bamberger Ranch Preserve on your social media channels, and make sure to check in every once in a while and see what we're up to.